Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and today we're going to be talking about the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024. Now, I have with me today one of the go-to experts on this subject, Dan Knowles, FRICS of Websters Surveyors. Welcome, Dan. Good to have you in.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay, Dan, what I should explain to our viewers is this new act, which was something that had gone on probably for the last 2 years being formulated, was actually rushed through Parliament just before the election was announced. Some of it seems to have gone through, other little bits seem to have been left behind, if I've got it right. And we now, knowing what the result of the election is, we're going to have to see what the new government wants to do in terms of finishing the job off, or I suppose scrapping it, starting again, or making amendments to it. But perhaps you'd like to tell us in sort of fairly simple terms, that's because I'm not too bright, what the Act is about and what it's trying to achieve.
Okay, well, you're absolutely right that it was rushed through at the last moment. There was a process called the wash-up process. So on the last day of the last Parliament, so just after Rishi Sunak said we're dissolving Parliament, waiting for the general election, we're going to have a long period of campaigning, government decided, well, let's see if we can rush through this piece of legislation. They'd been talking about it for quite some time, but there were a few contentious parts as well. And some of those contentious parts were dropped at the last minute with a view to, well, let's come back to them at a later date.
Sure.
And let's effectively pass legislation into law, and then at a later date, we'll fill in the gaps for what's been missed.
Okay. So, really, to my mind, having you can tell how sad my life is. A bit of bedtime reading, looking at the Act.
You're not on your own, I promise you.
Reading it through. There's two sectors to it, really, just in my mind. One is protection for long leasehold tenants in terms of ground rent, service charge, making all that a lot more transparent. Subject to ground rents come up. And then on the other hand, there's then the more complex side of the Act, which deals with lease extensions. And for our viewers' benefit, so perhaps you've got a 100-year lease that's run down to 60, 70, 80 years or whatever it is, and it needs renewing. Otherwise, you won't be able to get finance on it if somebody buys it or whatever else. So one is a very technical half of the Act. The other is a more protective element, and perhaps we could deal with those two almost separately. But first of all, I want to try and understand and explain to our viewers, it's gone through Parliament, but it's not enacted, is it?
Well, it's gone through Parliament, but what has to happen for any new piece of law to effectively become operative, becoming operative is the right word to use here, is it then needs secondary legislation, something called a commencement order.
Right.
So very, very, very simple piece of law saying that this part of the Act becomes operative as of this date, and this piece of the Act becomes operative on that date. And I would expect that there are some parts of the Act that will most likely become operative very soon, some of the non-contentious parts, and some of the more contentious parts, perhaps government, or the new Labour government now, maybe they might decide to delay those for a period of time.
Okay. And are you confident that the new Labour government will carry the Act through?
For the majority of it, certainly. I think there's a lot of it that's very non-contentious. So on the protective side, making sure that there is transparency on things like service charges, ground rents, there aren't many people who are going to complain about that.
Okay. Well, just picking up on that point, my simplistic understanding is, for example, if you have an argument with your freeholder about items on the service charge, in the past, the freeholders said, well, fine, let's go to court then, because actually all my legal costs will be covered because I can recharge them on the service charge, whether I win or whether I lose. So as a leaseholder, you're on a road to nowhere, really. And that's a point that is being clarified in this Act, isn't it? That no longer will a freeholder be able to just automatically reclaim his legal costs, come what may.
Absolutely. And I can't imagine there would be too many impartial people, at least, who could complain about that.
No.
And on the other part of the Act, which is probably the one that I'm more involved with as well, with people dealing with lease extensions or groups of leaseholders buying their freeholds or freeholders looking at selling their interests. There are some non-contentious parts of that as well, which I expect will come through quite quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the subjects is this business of long leaseholders taking over, in effect, the ownership of their building.
Yeah.
Now, up till now, we've either had a leasehold situation where the leaseholders are beholden to the freeholder, or alternatively, the freeholder has sold those tenants the freehold rights and they become part freehold owners. So we've got those two distinctions.
Yes.
But there is talk of the introduction of Commonhold, which is a third way of ownership. Yeah. Perhaps you'd like to explain to us about that.
Yeah. Well, Commonhold, it was actually introduced a few years back, but there's only a handful of or so Commonhold properties in the entire of the country right now. So it hasn't really caught on. But what Labour have suggested in their manifesto, and I assume that they're going to go through with it now because it is in the manifesto.
Well, you've got a promise from politicians, haven't you?
Well, yeah, sometimes they're honest. There are some better ones than others.
Okay.
What they've suggested is they want to make Commonhold the default tenure for any new developments, rather than freehold, with groups of leaseholders then potentially later buying their freehold if they wanted to. What I would question, though, is it actually going to be fit for purpose? Because to me, the reason that a lot of people do like the idea of Commonhold is because they want to control. They want to control the building. They want to control who contracts are let out to for service charge work, for example. They want to control the ground rents. But actually, you can do a lot of this just by acquiring the share of freehold anyway. So that there's already a process there. There's also a right to manage process as well, or if you don't want to acquire your freehold, but you simply want to take over the management of the building. And where I see that there might eventually become a 2 or even 3-tier market is with new developments that become Commonhold, if that actually happens, and it's going to take a while for that sort of legislation to go through, of course, and we could be looking at a number of years here. Anyone buying a flat in one of those developments will automatically then become part of the company who are effectively owning and controlling that block. But do you necessarily want to be responsible for maintenance of the building?
Well, let me just pause there, because having consulted on quite a few properties and I've seen a lot of the issues that come up. I mean, I think our viewers should know that if a freeholder, for instance, for whatever reason, can't collect enough service charge to run the building properly, then unfortunately it's that freeholder that's going to have to put his hand in his pocket and run the building properly, because he's obliged under the terms of a normal long lease. So it's quite an onerous obligation in some respects to have control of the freehold or the management of the building, isn't it? Or it can be.
Absolutely, and particularly post-Building Safety Act as well, with a lot of properties that are clad, for example, on the fire safety concerns.
Yeah.
And some buildings will have what's called a sinking fund, so effectively a savings account that all of the flat owners pay into each year. And the idea with the savings account is eventually the money mounts up, and if there are some major works that need to be done, let's say the roof needs to be replaced, worst case example, you then use that money for that. But then there are plenty of these buildings that don't have those savings accounts attached to them either, and they're the ones that are really at risk if people then become liable for it.
Yeah, I mean, I just looking around where we are now in Canary Wharf, there's a lot of 50, 60, 70 story buildings, some of them with 4 or maybe even 6 lifts in. Now, 25 years actually in a building's life goes pretty quickly, and I can see some of these buildings being faced with huge charges for refurbishment with lifts, and the ones with swimming pools in where everything needs to be sort of gutted out and redone again. So again, I say it's quite an onerous, or I won't say onerous, but serious responsibility to own one of these buildings, isn't it? So I do welcome this kind of Reform Act where everything is going to be more transparent and clear. The worry that I have, Dan, is that I wouldn't like to see, for instance, that building under one type of regime, that building on another, and that one over there on another. You've been involved in the valuation business, I'm sure, with your surveying practice. How are you going to differentiate between these different types of ownership? How are you going to do it?
With some degree of difficulty. We'd have to look first of all at how well are the buildings actually being run. Where buildings are share of freehold, almost implicitly the leaseholders have decided at some point that they want to run the building. And it may be that some of those have sold on and other people have taken their place at some point, but at least they want to own the building, and there would have been a number of them who would have hopefully have the relevant skills to manage that building.
There's an issue.
Yes. but when it comes to Commonhold, people won't have that choice. If you're buying a flat in that building, you automatically
take on the responsibility.
Exactly. And I'm sure some of the flats around the corner here in Canary Wharf, that there's a lot of non-UK residents who will own the properties as well, and most likely rent them out. Do they necessarily want to be controlling the building if they're living miles away?
I'm sure you know just as well as I do. I'm consulted on a couple of buildings down here. The overseas ownership was running at about 73, 74%.
Exactly, yep.
Now, if you send out a questionnaire saying, would you like to run this building yourself? The answer comes back, yes, of course. The next time you write and say, well, we need sort of 5,000 quid from you for lawyers' fees, changeover and all the rest of it, I mean, they disappear like a rat up a drain pipe, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
Or their sole interest is, where's my rent?
Yeah, and you mentioned lifts earlier. I've known lifts be replaced with major works bills coming in at £7,000, £8,000, £10,000 per leaseholder on much smaller blocks than these.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we're going to take a break now. After the break, we'll just delve into another one of the subjects covered in the bill, which is lease extensions at the end of. As you start to run down the term of your lease, you obviously want to feel secure that you can stay in the property or alternatively sell it to maximum value, and we'll discuss how we deal with that one.
Okay, great.
Okay, I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again after the break when we'll continue our discussion on the Leasehold Reform Act. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm joined by Dan Knowles of Websters Surveyors, our go-to expert on the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act. So welcome back, Dan. Let's now get on to the most complex part of the Act, which is dealing with lease extensions. So as I outlined before the break, let's say we have a 90-year lease, we've used 20 of it, it's down to 70. I'm starting to get twitchy because people coming to buy my flat can't fund it because the banks won't like the 70-year lease. Yeah. In the past, we've gone to, I suppose, a form of arbitration with the freeholder and the leaseholder. There are set calculations which work out the worth of the property today, the worth of the property with an extended lease, and a provision for the ground rents for the future. Yeah? So what happens next?
It's actually the seller who serves the notice there. So the seller will be advised by a chartered surveyor, and the chartered surveyor will tell them this is how much we think you need to be paying your landlord, normally a freeholder, to extend the lease. But it's rather a perverse situation because, of course, it's the buyer who is on the hook for paying that money to satisfy their lender. So the seller serves the notice, but the buyer is the one who's actually paying the money. Now, under the new legislation, that 2-year rule is done away with.
Okay.
So the buyer can serve the notice themselves as soon as they buy. If
Well,
that's
that's
what
not
they
a
want to
bad
do.
thing, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would expect that that's part of the legislation that will come in very quickly. Not many people are going to argue with that. And then coming down to what they actually pay, well, there's a few elements of the calculation. First of all, as you rightly say, they need to pay off the ground rent. So that they need to work out that if the ground rent is X amount now, and maybe it doubles every 25, 33 years or so, or increases by inflation, whatever it may be, one lease will be different to another. The landlord is not going to have the right to receive that anymore because the ground rent goes down to a peppercorn, effectively free.
Free.
So we need to work out how much is fair to pay the landlord, normally a freeholder, to no longer receive the ground rent. Now, under the new legislation, that is still going to be payable, but there will be a set rate that applies to. So there'll be a set yield for valuers to use to calculate that. But along with that, there is also going to be a cap to the ground rent, but purely for the purposes of that calculation. So not a general cap, but purely for the purposes of calculating how much to extend the lease.
Right.
And that cap is at 0.1% of the long lease value. So let's say it's a £500,000 property with a long lease. Then any ground rent above £500 is disregarded for the purpose of the calculations.
Let's say it's my lease. I'm living
Yep.
in there. I'm selling it. If we get an extension, somebody's got to pay. You're saying the buyer will pay the extension price. Yep. Do I get a cut of that? Does the landlord have it all, or where does it go?
Now, well, that's payable to the landlord, normally the freeholder.
Okay.
But then there are other elements as well. So in your example, I think you said there were about 70 years or so left. So any leases under 80 years, there's part of the calculation called marriage value.
Right.
And marriage value, in simple terms, it's the difference between a short lease value, so anything under 80 years, and a long lease value. And half of that difference gets paid to the landlord, normally the freeholder. But under the new legislation, that's going. There's going to be no more marriage value, which is going to make buying short leases an awful lot cheaper than they have been to date.
Well, isn't somebody going to complain about that?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I strongly suspect that there will be legal challenges to it, possibly on human rights grounds, because effectively an interest is being taken away from a landlord, the freeholder, with no compensation paid for that element of it.
Sure. Well, you've cut out part of his earning element, haven't you?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And let's say you're a freeholder who only bought your right 2-3 years ago. You would have paid a certain amount of money in expectation that at some point in the future, the leaseholder is going to want to extend, at which point you get your windfall. If that's taken away from you, there's certainly a school of thought to say that there could be a successful legal challenge to that. And that's one of the elements of the new legislation, which hasn't come in yet. And it's one of the elements that may take a while to come in, because the new Labour government, and we've got King's Speech coming up as well, and we may well know more then, the new Labour government have got to decide when do they want to put that element of the legislation into place.
Yes.
And they might just push it down the road a bit to allow for those legal challenges to at the very least start.
Okay. If I'm a leaseholder sitting at home now listening to this programme, I think the question I'd want to ask you is this. I've given an example of a lease getting down to about 70 years and becoming probably the critical point at which, I need to do something about it.
Yeah.
What, in your view, is the trigger point for getting some advice? Is it when it hits the 100-year mark, from, you know, if it's down from a 150-year lease? When should somebody get in touch with a professional like yourself?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things in play here. So first of all, with long leases, so anything above 80 years, there are a lot of people who are approaching us right now wanting to extend their leases now, because they know that they're not going to benefit from this abolition of marriage value. Doesn't apply to them.
Doesn't apply retrospectively.
No.
No. Okay.
But the other part of the calculation, which I haven't come on to, is what's called the deferment. So when any lease is extended, the term is pushed back. So let's say you've got a 90-year lease, for example. If you extend it, you get an extra 90 years at the moment. The new legislation will actually push that up to 990, but that is somewhat of a gimmick, because in valuation terms it makes very little difference.
Sure.
But they get an extra 90 years, which means that the landlord is having to wait an extra 90 years to get their value back.
Through ground rent?
Well, not through the ground rent, but the actual property itself. Let's say we've got a £500,000 property with a 90-year lease. That means at the moment the landlord has got the right to receive that £500,000 property and do almost whatever they like with it. There are some restraints, but in 90 years' time from now.
Okay. But then the time goes out.
Yeah, and they're going to push that back for another 90 years. Now that's called the deferment, and part of the legislation is going to set how valuers calculate how the landlord gets compensated for that amount. And there is a school of thought, which a lot of experts are suggesting right now, is that element may become a lot more expensive. So it could be that the new legislation effectively gives with one hand, makes it cheaper for leaseholders, but makes it more expensive by taking with the other hand. I think I've heard this one before.
Yes. Anyway. Yeah.
So we're finding a lot of people with longer leases are choosing to extend now because they're really afraid of, well, what's coming around the corner.
Sure.
And we don't know when it's going to be.
Well, I think the moral is here, get expert advice at the earliest possible stage, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
And you need to understand your freeholder's position as well as your own. I think that's equally important, isn't it? You need to know the balance of the two issues, really.
You do, and there are a lot of freeholders now who are deciding to exit the market, particularly those with a number of short leases, because right now they're looking at what the law is today, and then thinking if someone was to extend their lease or collectively buy a freehold together with the other leaseholders, that they would be paying marriage value. So a lot of freeholders now decide, well, let's divest of our assets now, whilst the money's still pretty good, because if we wait later down the line, it may be a hell of a lot less.
It's not going to get better. Okay, Dan, just in the last minute we've got on the show, any shortfalls in this legislation? Anything? Have you got a wish list that you'd like to see in there that's not?
For me, it's all about timing now. I think we need certainty on what those rates are going to be, because we need to be able to advise leaseholders and freeholders, this is what the cost is going to be. We're in a poor position right now where we're saying it could be terrible, but we don't know, and we don't know when it's going to be fixed. So I'd like certainty.
Okay, wouldn't we all?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you for watching. I'm Stephen Galpin. You've been listening to Dan Knowles, FRICS of Websters Surveyors, give us his expert opinion on the new Act. We hope it comes into play shortly. We do need certainty, and I think the idea of making things a lot more transparent is a welcome addition to our industry. So again, thank you for watching. Join me again next time on Property Matters.